Hi, my name is Annette Oltmans, and I've been asked to share some of my story. And before I do that, I just want to take a moment to say that I grew up in an intact family with very loving parents. But if I could say what might have contributed to part of why I chose the type of partner that I chose, I would say that the one thing my parents did not do for me was to really develop an emotional IQ. So really allowing me to express my emotions freely and to be good listeners and support my emotional experiences. So they would really minimize my emotions. They would not allow me to express emotions. I had to conform to a certain behavior. And so what that, children need to have the support of adults to validate their emotional experiences, to validate their feelings. And without that, it can't develop. And so that's what I would say. I really had outward confidence. I was an accomplished gymnast and I was accomplished in my academic studies and those sorts of things, but I wasn't confident interpersonally. I always felt, because I wasn't allowed to express my emotions and have those emotions validated, I thought something might be unlovable about me, or I didn't trust my perceptions. I didn't have 100% confidence to trust my perceptions of various interpersonal situations. So moving forward, when I got married, I chose a very successful, accomplished spouse, but he too was not emotionally, he was very intellectually astute, but he wasn't, come to find out years later, he wasn't really in touch with his emotions. He knew a few basic emotions like anger or frustration, some of the obvious ones that are so often encouraged in boys to express. But the softer emotions and really being in tune with those, he was not. And so anytime that we had an interaction where I would have a complaint, a reasonable complaint or a reasonable request, it was met with what I term at the Men Project is covert emotional abuse. So that is anything like, it's defensive tactics to avoid authentic conversation. So instead of two people coming together and really being able to share their vulnerabilities and their preferences, that was not allowed to occur. I would experience deflections or blame shifting, false accusations, anything to defensively protect himself from having to take responsibility. And in turn, then I was the one on the defense, having to defend myself and plea for my voice in the relationship. And when I try to describe covert emotionally abusive behaviors, I like to use the analogy of the image of a maze. There's a maze is the representation of a conversation. There's an entry point and there's an exit point, and there's basically one path that moves you through to solutions. But there's a myriad of dead ends and blocked pathways. And when you're dealing with somebody who's emotionally abusive, you don't experience the path of least resistance. You experience constant blocks, stonewalling, deflections, like I said, defensive tactics to thwart the conversation. So rather than having a conversation where there's mutual respect, where there's mutual validation, where there's a true desire to listen and hear what the other person is feeling and wanting to express, and then coming up with compromises to meet those requests or to come up with mutual solutions. Even if you don't agree, you can respectfully choose to disagree, but it is not, each person was allowed to fully express themselves and be heard and have the respect of the other party to receive what they had to say. The most painful thing for me was that I didn't understand what was happening. I mean, there were actually two really painful experiences. The first was being locked into this maze of confusion without understanding what was happening. And this is very common. People who are in it, if there's not raging and name-calling and foul language and that sort of thing, the overt kinds of abuses, those are easier to identify. Someone can say, oh my gosh, I was called, blippity blip, and I know that's abusive, or I was pushed, I know that's abusive, or I was, treated in an overt way. It's more easily to define, but covert emotional abuse is very confusing. And if you consider, like lying is a covert behavior, for example. So if you consider that just one behavior repeated in a pattern is enough to be destructive to a relationship, imagine how confusing it is if multiple behaviors are in play. And so it was very painful for me to not be able to discern what was happening. And unfortunately, even though we had the resources to be able to enlist professional help of high accolades, they were not trained in emotional abuse. And that is something that I've since learned. If therapists have not undergone extensive training in the specific category of emotional abuse, they are not necessarily equipped to help. And so that was really a wearing down process that was even more traumatizing, because as certain behaviors were playing out in a therapeutic setting, they were not able to identify those behaviors. They were getting caught up in the minutia, and that was really painful to have therapeutic, what I viewed at the time as like an authoritative, or I perceived them as an authoritative person. They were significantly letting me down and not solving any problems. No problems were solved. The most traumatizing situation out of all of this, and over time I did develop post-traumatic stress disorder from my marital situation, but what was even more traumatizing was when I finally found the courage to reach out for help. I went to the leaders of my couples Bible study group, whom I had been part of for 14 years, and rather than support me, believe my story, and when I was finally able to articulate more of what was happening, rather than believe me, they asked me pointed questions. They interrogated me. They interrupted my train of thought as I was trying to express the experiences I was having. And so it was a very disruptive type of conversation. It wasn't one that was embracing my story. They were coming from a stance like they didn't believe me. Oh, I can't imagine that he would be that way. It must have been something that you did or said, or you need to be more submissive, or you need to pray more. It was condescending and not supportive. And in fact, they actually really went into judging me. And that was extremely traumatic, because that was who I felt was my support group. And to have people that you feel that you have a strong connection with, that I loved them and believe that they loved me, and to have them fail in such a way, I've since come to learn is it exacerbates an individual's trauma. And it significantly exacerbated mine, especially then when they gave me ultimatums. I must re-enter couples therapy, or I will never be invited back to the group, was one thing, because I chose to end couples therapy because it wasn't working. It was more traumatizing. And I was correct in my decision, because I was not with a properly trained therapist. So to impose ultimatums on me and not on my husband showed that they supported my husband and not me. They were judging me, and that was highly traumatic. And it's so often what victims, like rape victims, go through, when it's like, well, why did you park your car in the parking structure if you knew you had to walk there at 2 a.m? Why, all the reasons to reverse the blame onto the victim rather than to really support them. It's so easy sometimes to either play neutral or choose the side of the perpetrator, because the perpetrator asks nothing of you, just that you remain silent. But a victim asks that you connect with them, that you support them, and that you believe their experience, and that there may be a call for action to intervene. And so often people don't want to do that. They don't want to speak about the unspeakable, the stigmatized topics. And I felt that I was mistreated in that way. And also looking back, I can see that they were very patriarchal. They taught marriage classes in the community. They would use this book called Love and Respect, which really promotes respect towards men, but not mutual respect towards women. And they felt that I was not submitting enough. And I can look back now and see that every person in my Bible study group was following in line with this patriarchal stance where women must submit. And so that was projected onto me even in a moment of crisis. It was particularly painful for me to receive a response like that from them when they had seen me over time start to deteriorate. I had lost a significant amount of weight. I was basically skin and bones, and I had a myriad of autoimmune illnesses, latent autoimmune diabetes. I had been rushed to the emergency room some 13 times because my blood pressure wasn't stabilized or my blood sugar levels were fluctuating and dropping. And so clearly, physiologically, something was really happening with me. And I also was known to be somebody who loved the Lord and who was very active in my personal growth. And so to just doubt me when my history showed something entirely different, solely because I was disparaging my husband, was just really traumatic. It took a lot of courage for me to finally speak out and say something against his behavior because I was so conformed to this respect the head of the household mentality.